Welcome. Thanks for joining us. So, as we approach the end of term, we just wanted to focus on this process of how we're going to support children and students during the summer holidays. And there's a couple of webinars coming up focusing on two key issues living in our brains in the summer holidays. The two key issues are to do with learning and memory and to do with managing mood and motivation when there's less structure in the summer. So, leaping into learning this summer. And it's been fantastic to work with you throughout the year. It's really exciting to see so many schools joining the family. There's 120 schools now. We worked it out the other day. It's 25,000 families that we're supporting with your fantastic work. And you are leading schools in bringing them into the neuroscience revolution. So thank you so much. So our mission, remember, is to support every member of the community from being a brain bot to being a neuro ninja. And the summer holidays present a particular challenge for the brain because the brain does not recognize these summer holidays. Its memory system works on the basis of strengthening connections for information that's been used and adding to that information as new information becomes available. And in terms of mood and motivation, the systems are designed to respond to what we're currently doing. And if we stop doing stuff, the brain doesn't do some response like an electrical appliance. It doesn't power down. In fact, in some respects, it can power up in the sense that there's not any particular thing for the prefrontal cortex at the front of the head to focus on. So the team of rivals' brain behind can get into a bit of an argument, circuits falling out with each other, and lots of young people and children support surprisingly lower mood over the course of the summer than they were expecting. They were expecting to feel great and they end up not feeling so good, and that's partly because they're in a space where they haven't got as much to do, and therefore they can fall foul of circuits that make judgments about productivity, but more on that soon. So our mission this summer is to support families to become neuro ninjas, and we wanted to give you a heads up as to what we're talking about with them. So today, why is summer learning loss a huge issue for the learning brain? Let's be honest, while having a summer holidays may be fantastic for staff in schools, and many people might argue, particularly after the year we've had, a requirement, it's designed probably to help harvest and for children to go out and pick fruit and hops in the fields. It's actually rubbish for the brain. And if we were redesigning the holidays, we'd have maybe 6 weeks of school, a couple of weeks off, 6 weeks of school, a couple of weeks off. But it's too complicated now across different local authorities, perhaps, to achieve that. But if we were designing learning around the brain, that's what we do. And we'll also look at what we can do about summer learning loss. So, brain cells don't recognize the summer holidays. Learning is three processes, not one. Learning cannot be judged in a single lesson. Anyone that says that it can doesn't understand neuroscience. Neuroscience tells us how the brain learns, and we're going to recap that briefly. Learning is a process that unfurls over a number of hours, days, and weeks after the initial information. The brain is a huge associative network, and it needs to include the new information inside pre-existing memory structures. Once it's there, it can then connect it up, and the more connections it makes, the more able we are to access that information from lots of different pathways. So we need to help keep children and students get brains engaged and active over the summer holidays. Our brains are live wired by experience, and even a 6-week period of summer break can have impacts on the brain. Connections that haven't been used for a while weaken, memories fade, mood and motivation drops. So whatever we use our brains for, they get to encode that process, and they are constantly changing on the basis of what we use them for throughout our lives. So we are different every day, and certainly different every couple of months as our brain constantly updates itself. So why do we need to keep the brain learning and ticking over during the course of the summer? Because those connections that are there will only remain there if they're used a little bit during the summer and we engage in short bursts. In fact, what we're going to call them for the children and the students is learning reps. So if you go to the gym or you do any sort of exercise, you'll know about reps, repetitions. We're talking about learning reps, and we will design learning reps for primary and secondary students, and we will release them on YouTube every week during the course of the summer holidays, and we'll explain that information to the parents just before that, in that first week, in that last week just before the summer holidays. So summer learning loss contains within it three nested threats to learning. First, connections weaken for knowledge across the brain because they're just not used. Productivity and purpose drop, so motivation to maintain learning fades. Memories are more sticky when we're interested and engaged. You can map that in terms of certain neurochemicals. For example, acetylcholine makes memories more sticky. If we're less engaged and interested, we've perhaps got less acetylcholine in key memory circuits, so we're going to remember less information. And the other thing that happens in holidays, particularly for teenagers, but actually for all families, is we ignore our biorhythms, which disrupts our sleep, we disrupt our diet and exercise routines in a way that leaves us as a less good version of ourselves. So we're basically going to bang on about those 12 rocks and maintaining well-being every day. It's a responsibility. It's a commitment we have to our body and our brain to produce the best mind possible. It's a commitment that we have to our families to produce the best version of ourselves. And when our brain has less to do, it doesn't power down into some sleep mode. It can actually turn on itself. Remember, the brain is a team of rivals, different circuits that evolved at different times to do different things, and it can turn on itself. And that's what actual lived experience from young people would tell us. Why does it do this? Well, one of the key reasons is you've got different circuits that evolved to do different things at different times, and some circuits in our brain evolved to judge the trustworthiness, contribution, and productivity of other members of tribes. Remember, we lived in groups of 150 until reasonably recently, 20,000 years ago, which is reasonably recent in terms of biological time. So those circuits that evolved to measure contribution, productivity, and trustworthiness shine out into the world, and we're constantly judging other people's responses and behavior. We're doing that automatically, but that process of looking out into the world also goes in, and those circuits look across our own output, our own contribution, our own productivity, and actually, by comparison, those circuits immediately see as we hit a low patch where there's not a lot happening in the summer holidays, and they can start having a go at ourselves. You haven't done much today, have you? You've not really contributed at all, actually. And then you can get grumpy and get stuck in a ruminatory low mood, stuck on that ruminatory ring road. And if you wanted to see a video on that, go to our YouTube channel. It's a really popular one. It just looks at where you get stuck in your head when you're ruminating, brooding, going over and over a problem without actually finding a solution. So those circuits that I've mentioned evolved to keep us connected in a community and to judge whether other people were trustworthy and useful in terms of being in our tribe. Because if they were wastes of space, we needed to get rid of them. They weren't going to necessarily help us very much. So it's really important that we understand that when the brain isn't busy, when the prefrontal cortex at the front of the head doesn't have something to aim at, those other circuits can have a very loud, rowdy, and potentially distressing party. This also means that our self-esteem can suffer during the holidays because we see ourselves doing less. Self-esteem is a renewable resource. It's not there the entire time in terms of we build our self-esteem and it's always there. It is a daily response, partly contributed to not simply by the way other people see us, although that's obviously significant, the relationships we have, the value other people place in us, the connections and the quality of our friendships, but also it's an internal process, and we contribute to our own self-esteem by what we see ourselves doing. And by dint of being in the summer holidays, many of us, and particularly teenagers, can end up in a space where they're doing far less and feeling not great about doing far less. So, important, fundamental, you'll see this in our Twitter feed a lot during the summer. If you don't plan each day, your brain does passive and easy. And the problem we face in the 21st century is there's a lot more passive and easy out there. There's Netflix, there's Instagram, there's sitting about watching catch up on BBC iPlayer. There's just many ways of doing passive and easy. Passive and easy is the brain circuits just using the pre-existing neural structures as they're doing that process. So it's really important to plan a day every day. That doesn't mean work every day. That means planning a day. I'm going to go for a cycle. I'm going to ring that friend. I'm going to do some gardening. I'm going to do some cooking. Really important to plan each day to have that sense of productivity. So that's what's happening in the brain. And the other thing that can affect mood and motivation is the downward spiral. So we can end up feeling a bit low in the way that we've described. And our mood, which is a snapshot of our body, brain and mind and how they're doing right now, can get stuck feeling low and not feeling like we want to do very much because we haven't done very much. So we don't feel like we want to do very much. So we end up in a kind of downward spiral, stepping down. And the bottom of the downward spiral is depression, laying in bed with a duvet over us. And there are obviously many routes into depression, but one of the iterative routes that all of us can take is the downward spiral. So it's really important to understand that downward spiral. And we also need to be aware of mood congruent attentional bias. So that is that process that happens when we're feeling a particularly strong emotion like sadness or anger. Our hippocampus, deep in our subcortical areas of our brain underneath the neocortex, can unhelpfully remind us of all the previous times we felt sad. And those memories can tip out and add to that feeling of sadness, so we can feel sad about being sad. This might explain why, when we're having an argument with someone, we then remember all the previous times they've really annoyed us, and we add fuel to the anger fire. So mood congruent attentional bias is really important to be aware of. We can get ourselves in a right old steam up. So it's really important that all of us, throughout the summer, and support children and students and we model this for them. When you don't feel like doing things, you stop doing things, meaning you miss out on the positive brain changing effects of doing those things. Remember, the brain builds the mind. So we can shift our neuronal firings around by doing stuff, going to do a bit of exercise, even if we don't feel like it, going for a walk with a friend, even if we don't feel like it, listening to a podcast that we find interesting, even if we don't feel like it, watching a bit of comedy to lift our mood, even if we don't feel like it. All of those things will make a difference. So rather than stop doing those things, when you don't feel like doing something, do it anyway. The feelings of pleasure will follow and you'll do more things and you'll move up the upward spiral rather than down the downward spiral. There are many parts of adult life, and we're modelling that for children and students, that are about the mood not being aligned with what we've got to do right now. Perhaps the perfect example of that is Monday morning. Not many people are rubbing their hands and diving in to the working week. There are many aspects of the working week that people enjoy, but that just movement from Sunday to Monday. And it's really important for young people and children to understand that the mood doesn't always need to be aligned with what you've got to do. It's great if it is, but it's not always. You should do those things anyway. So to understand summer learning loss, we've just looked at mood, but let's look at summer learning loss. We need to just recap briefly how brains learn and how memory works. So our brain is an incredibly powerful learning machine. It's a pattern finisher. The neocortex, imagine a napkin 2 millimeters thick in a wine glass, that wrinkly folded effect. That is the neocortex. That's the reason it's all wrinkly and pink, dripping over the top of the brain. That is the learning brain, and the brain learns like this. It's three processes. It's getting it, understanding it in the lesson, practicing it to encode it, and using it. And you can accelerate that process by spacing out your learning, and that's some of the things we're going to suggest over the course of the summer. So understanding it is just the live ability of the living brain to manipulate information and deal with it live and understand it, to finish the pattern, to work it out. And our brains are exceptionally good at doing that. But that process isn't learning. That process is understanding it in the first place. But in order for it to become learning, that needs to be encoded. And while we can put that into our lessons and put that into our schemes of work and put that into our curriculums, we need to get our children and our parents to support us in that process. And you see that a lot in primary school with a massive focus on reading and that whole dialogue back and forth, and in secondary school around homework. but we need to get much more efficient about the sorts of homework we set. We need to set homework that supports children to practice and encode, homework that spaces out information. And that's the information that we're going to be dropping in our YouTube videos each week. So just get parents to log on to our YouTube channel and you'll see those bits of information about ways to do learning this week. In short, learning reps. We'll be setting learning repetitions for families to help them encode and practice. And then finally, learning is recalling that information. Recalling has an impact on the neural structure of memory. You're pulling the information out, encoding it again, and then using it and deploying it in novel situations. So we know that learning occurs not in a visually, auditory, kinesthetic way. That's all a bunch of guff and nonsense. This is how learning occurs with any species that's got neurons, all the way back to sea slugs with their 330 neurons. This is where we originally understood what's going on. So neurons fire, action potentials, electrical impulses move down them, and as they fire, that information leaps across from one neuron to another. As an axon fires, that's the wire, it generates a protein that then causes that nucleus in the middle of that star-shaped structure, that's the nucleus at one end of the neuron, to generate a chemical, a protein, which then travels out to the synapses, the gaps between this neuron and the next neuron. It takes time to build that protein up, and it takes time for that protein to diffuse across the cell to get into that synaptic cleft. Once it arrives in the synaptic cleft, the next time that action potential fires, those dendrites, those projections from the neuron reaching out to the next neuron, they will be enforced and strengthened by the arrival of that protein, meaning that the next time that neuron fires, it's much more likely to stimulate an action potential in a connected neuron. And that is the process of learning, and it takes time for that chemical to build up. So that is why spacing practice is so important. That is why learning is a process. That is why going around with a clipboard and saying, oh, they seem to have learnt that, is really just magical thinking. It's not actually scientifically based at all. So we've got these synaptic clefts. They are 2,000 times smaller than a human hair, a few nanometers across. And that is where learning begins to be strengthened by the arrival of the chemicals produced by the DNA in the neuron itself. So that means learning is changing genes. It's turning genes on and off. And those synapses are being strengthened. And that change is brought on by the genes. And that process of strengthening then means that neurotransmitters, chemicals, can move more quickly from one side of the synaptic cleft to the other, stimulating an action potential in a connected neuron. And for complicated ideas, and lots of complicated ideas in learning, reading, lots of complicated ideas, that is stacks and stacks of neurons connected in neural columns, all interrelated to each other, all strengthening different synapses. In terms of information processing, synapses are switches. They're strengthened and they're weakened on the basis of experience. And then that strengthening of those synapses causes repeat activation in sets of neurons, which then causes myelination along the axon of that neuron. So myelination, supported by glial cells, that neuron will start to produce a fatty sheath that insulates the action potential and enables it to travel faster and faster. So when a bit of information is well learned, the information is conveyed rapidly down a myelinated neuron to the next myelinated neuron. When neurons wire together, they fire together. We've known that since 1949. Donald Hebb did some fantastic work at learning at the level of the neuron, this wiring and firing together principle. 15 meters per second to 150 meters per second, 10 times faster. That's why once we've learnt stuff, it's much easier to process it. Because that's how the brain works. It's an energy efficient pattern recognizing biological machine, and it will make things that we do repeatedly more easy to do because it saves energy, and it does that through the way we've just described, strengthening synapses, thickening neurons and wiring them up. And once we have established network, our brain continues to sift and sort the information we have, linking it to knowledge we already have, making those connections and links. And that's why it's so important to carry on the learning over the summer, chucking in new bits of information so the brain's got work to do to make it link to pre-existing bits of information. If we don't do that in a systematic way, we're going to see weakening of those synapses. And just a word about memory, because obviously long-term memory is incredibly important. Short-term memory is pretty rubbish. We've got a short-term memory. It holds between 4 and 7 items, while neurons in the front of the brain, where short-term memory is, are firing. And when those neurons don't fire anymore, we forget the information. We might say to ourselves, I remember this, I remember this, I remember this, while we're experiencing the learning. And then as soon as those neurons stop firing, we forget it. But we've got a commodiously large long-term memory where we can hold millions and millions of bits of information. Google have just started mapping bits of the brain with neuroscientists. They've mapped 50,000 neurons so far, 130 million connections, 1.4 petaflops of storage data. That is 700 times more powerful in terms of storage capacity than a desktop computer, and that's a millimetre of brain tissue. So you've got plenty of space to store this information. You just got to get it in to long-term memory, and that's where the hippocampus comes in. So we're beginning to get a picture. We don't completely understand this yet, but we're beginning to get a picture of what memory is. Memory is the dots of experience connected by the hippocampus across the brain. So I'll just give you a simple example. You learn something in a lesson. So you learn some fractions in a lesson. So you have the visual sensory information, you have the physical sensory information, you have the auditory sensory information, you have the getting it process in the middle of your brain as you're getting the fractions. All of those experiences are connected and become associated by the hippocampus as learning fractions, a different set of synapses connecting up and wiring up. So one event is distributed over the brain, and at night what happens when events are significant and important, so if it's a dangerous event that we need to learn from instantly so we can avoid problems, if it's an event that we're interested in and our brain is interested in, or it's an event that's repeated, the hippocampus refires those memories overnight, those connections overnight, and reinforces some of those synapses overnight. It's a kind of memory organizing system, and it works on the basis really of use. So which neurons have been used during the day, which ones need reinforcing at night, and that repatterning overnight, that refiring happens double quick, treble quick. They looked at the hippocampuses of rats that had learnt a maze, and they found that the rat re-ran the maze, the same neurons fired again at night in deep NREM sleep, and it re-ran the maze much faster, 10, 20 times faster, several times during the course of dreaming and NREM sleep to reinforce those memories. And that may be what it looks like as your brain is refiring those memories, beginning to trace out those neural patterns overnight. So you need constant incoming information just to tickle those neurons to allow those synapses to fire, and that's what we're going to offer the children over the course of the summer. Because forgetting is an active process in the brain. There are proteins that rub out connections that haven't been used for a while, so those connections can be repurposed for other things. The brain is constantly spring cleaning itself, making sure it's got capacity to contain information. And remember, our brain finds it easiest to remember stuff that's dangerous to us, stuff that's interesting to us. That's why children can remember all Pokemon and their evolved forms, but forget their times tables. And if you don't repeat, your brain will delete. And it deletes at the rate of 70% every 24 hours. It literally pours out the information. You know, I do lots of one-to-ones with kids. We do lots of study capture sheets. I ask them to tell me what they learned at 9 o'clock this morning, maybe at 6 p.m. at night, and they've already begun to forget. And it's quite interesting just to listen to them. And you'll remember Ebbinghaus, you know, the forgetting curve. It always staggers me that we've lost maybe 58% of the information that we experienced in a lesson within an hour. And we've certainly lost 2/3 of it within 24 hours. So a reminder, summer learning loss creates those 3 nested threats to learning. Connections weaken across the brain, productivity and purpose drop, so motivation to maintain the learning fades, and we can ignore our biorhythms even more. We do that pretty much in the 21st century, but we can ignore them even more. So what can we do about summer learning loss? And this is what we're going to put into those webinars for parents. Strong arguments for well-being and learning behaviours during the summer, and that's the purpose of this webinar, to explore that and explain that to all of you. We're going to be asking families to think about planning every day. Even if it's a day of fun, it's really important to plan it. We're going to explore the importance of practice and little and often learning reps over the summer. Build in learning practices each week. We're going to ask families to think about listening to bodies in the sense of when do I need to go to sleep, eat when hungry, exercise, and the basic routines that support well-being. We're going to focus on how to manage worries, how to build a habit to help others, how to stay connected socially, and to use well-being habits to look particularly at sleep, exercise, food, and emotion over the course of the summer. So we're going to support families in relation to all of those things. And we'd like to wish all of you a fantastic summer holiday, and a final reminder to do your rocks every day. Take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. See you in September.